Hi everyone, I'm Adrian. That's Jay. That's Natalya. Natalya is a friend and a client. We'd like to thank her for joining us for this video. Philip unfortunately is sick and cannot join us today. And today we're going to talk about the McIntosh C70 versus the C2700. Both are tube preamplifiers. I've had a number of emails asking us to showcase the differences between McIntosh products. So I thought let's start with the C70 and the C2700. Now there's a particular reason for this. Both are all tubes. Both have MM and MC. Both are very close in price, except the 2700 has the DA2 DAC module built in. The C2700 has more inputs and more outputs. It's more full-featured, and it's in Canadian dollars, the C70 is $9,450 versus $10,800 for the C2700. So a difference is of only $1,350. And in fact, that difference is literally the cost of the DA2 DAC module. So if, for example, you had a McIntosh product with the DA1 module, you could upgrade it for $1,350. So it's literally just the DAC cost. So I thought, well, let's compare the two, since in theory, they should be using very similar circuitry as far as the tube preamp section is concerned. Now, the C70 is the one of the 70th anniversary products that McIntosh released last year to celebrate their 70th anniversary, along with the McIntosh tube power amplifier. As I mentioned, both have MM and MC. Now, in terms of the cosmetics, the C70 is more of a retro look. It doesn't have any meters. It's got switches instead of knobs to do the inputs and controls. Both have treble and bass controls. In the C70 2700, it's got meters. It's more contemporary McIntosh look. It also has the HDMI ARC functionality, so you can connect a smart TV to it, and you can use your TV's remote control and turn the C2700 on, adjust the volume, and the C2700 will also process multi-channel Dolby and DTS and convert it into 2-channel so that your stereo system can play your TV viewing. So on the surface, the C2700 sounds like a literal bargain compared to the C70 because you get all of this functionality. You've got a lot more inputs, a bunch more outputs. You've got a DAC for $1,350 more. So it'll be interesting to see what the guys think in terms of this sound. So Natalya, why don't you start? What do you think of the sonic difference between the C70 and the C2700?
I listened to the C70 first, and it wasn't as inspiring as I would have hoped. It was a little bit flat for my taste, and I didn't know what was really wrong with the music. I thought it was just Jay's tracks because I don't really like his tracks a lot. But I put on a track that I knew well, and
hold on a minute.
Flat.
Wait, hold on a minute. You come to the store every so often and say, "Hey, what are you playing?" And it steals my tracks. What are you talking about? You don't like my tracks?
Oh gosh, I don't even know what to say about that.
Okay.
But when we hooked, well, when I say we, when Jay hooked up the C2700, there was a huge difference in tightness of bass, in control, in even just the sound of voice. I don't know what your special word for it is. It's the type of harmonics where
he calls it organic.
It just sounded
organic,
more exciting to listen to and more dynamic than the C70.
Okay. Jake?
Come on, disagree.
I pretty much agree, except that I would say the difference is minute in this case, because if I were to close my eyes and pretend this was an A/B test, I really wouldn't be able to tell from one or the other in an A/B test, because both has that classic McIntosh sound, laid back, soft, smooth, whatever you want to call it. very easy to listen to. You can crank it up if it feels like you can crank it up all the way up, and there will be no brightness or sibilance. You don't run into that, typical audiophile problem where you have to have it at a certain volume, because if you pass that point, it's not that the volume is too high, it's that the sibilance gets too high. You don't run into that problem with McIntosh gear. And this is true for both preamplifiers. I found both of them to be very smooth, very easy to listen to. But I found the exact same thing with Natalya. In fact, we did a comparison between the C70 and the BHK signature preamp from PS Audio. And in that video, I said the C70 sounded too soft for my liking. And I still stand by that. And in this comparison, we used the MC2152, which is a tube amplifier. And in this case, it was way too soft for my liking. Whereas the C2700 kind of made everything a little bit more in focus. The bass was tighter, the vocals were tighter, the separations were a little more clear, and there were distinctions in between notes and voices. Whereas the C70 seemed like the bass was coming from everywhere, had a large sound stage. So in that sense, it was a more tube characteristic to it. And that may be, I don't know, good for some people. But for me, it was just a little bit too indistinctive. I couldn't pinpoint instruments all that well compared to the C2700. And I found, in a way, the C70 to be resemblance of and I'm going to get a lot of hate for saying this, but the vintage McIntosh. It was a little bit more tubey, holographic, and kind of vivid.
Okay.
Wow.
I'm actually more confused now when I listen to what he just said.
All I heard was he agreed with me. But I'd have to say it is an interesting experience being able to switch between the two back and forth so you can hear the difference. I'm not sure if I would have heard the difference on my own without having experienced that, but I did know that the C2700, at least after I heard it, I knew that that's the music that I liked. As opposed to the C70, there was something that was not really missing. It just wasn't as exciting.
Right. And another thing that I want to add is that when Natalya and I heard back and forth, what we did was we played 2 tracks, switched, played 2 tracks, switched. And those 2 tracks were not random. It was like, vocal, bass, switch, vocal, bass, exact same track, and then switch, and so on and so forth. So this way we were able to tell, as fast as our audio memory can tell, the differences.
Okay. Well, I don't know who I should agree or disagree with.
Basically, we said the same thing.
I came in, again, very early this morning so that I could do this comparison without any interruptions and spend as much time as I wanted to. And originally, a couple of weeks ago, I was going to do the comparison for myself, not thinking about doing a video on it. I was pleasantly surprised at what I heard, but I needed more time. I was constantly getting interrupted, so I decided this morning that I would spend a lot of time. So I went through maybe about 8 or 9 tracks for both preamplifiers, and where I wasn't sure, I would go back and just keep doing that comparison. And some of the tracks I've listed in the previous video where we discussed our tracks that we use all the time, and I'm going to add a couple more just below this video. I started with the C70. And so the system, again, was the preamps under test. The amp is the MC2152. The speakers are the Sonus Faber Serafinos, one of my favorite speakers. And the source is the Lumin T2 streamer, taking the analog out from the streamer into both preamplifiers, since the C70 doesn't have a DAC. So we didn't test the DA2 DAC this time around. So let me read a couple of my notes. C70, huge soundstage, much like what Natalya said. In my case, I found that the delineation was very, very good. Beautiful details, beautiful sound. I kept saying more. I really enjoyed what I heard. Maybe it was just this morning and I just wasn't in the right mood for it. I just kept writing more, intimate. dense, very musical, yet not missing any details. I really enjoyed what I heard. In fact, I enjoyed it so much I kept forgetting to make notes, and I was going through song after song and just kept listening. And then when I finally caught myself, I would have to go back and then try to pay attention. And then after I finished listening, I would switch over to the 2700, and I said here, even more airy, cleaner, not as dense or warm, which I think speaks to what both of you heard. It just sounded more. To borrow a phrase from Jonathan Valin of The Absolute Sound, he talks about bottom up sound versus top down. So in other words, if the sound is tilted more towards the bass or tilted more towards the top end. And I found the C2700 more top down. In other words, a little bit more emphasis on the top. I also found that it was less microdynamic. So in other words, the dynamic shifts between at lower volumes weren't quite as lively. It did have clearer transients, which is interesting. So one of my cuts that I enjoyed listening to, Christian McBride, I found that the transients were clearer when he's scraping the bow across the strings. But ironically enough, the microdynamics were not quite as lively compared to the C70. It seemed also the 2700 had more bass. So overall, it would sound like, on paper at least, that I should have preferred the C2700. But in fact, from just a pure enjoyment standpoint, I actually preferred the C70. And when I first concluded that, I thought, no, that can't be right, because on paper, there's so much more pros on the 2700 versus the C70. But in fact, I found that I enjoyed listening to the C70, not by much, just enough that it just kept drawing me into the music. I would have to somewhat disagree a little bit with Jay in terms of his finding that I can't remember the words that you use, almost like a lush
vintage McIntosh sound.
Yeah. When I think vintage McIntosh, which I certainly have collected my fair share, I think of not just McIntosh, but a lot of older tube type products. And back then, that was the kind of sound that you typically would hear. I don't find that at all, because a lot of the earlier vintage products lacked separation, lacked detail, lacked transparency, lacked speed. I don't find that with any of these products. It was more of a degree of, did I want a slightly more spectacular sound like the C2700, or did I prefer a more cohesive sound and more involving as a result on the C70? And again, I want to hasten and say, we're not talking about a night and day difference. It's just a matter of degrees, but enough of a degree that for me, the choice was the C70. But having said that, I will say this. As a choice, either is superb. In the case of the C2700, if you need a DAC, where are you going to find a DAC that good for $1,350? You won't be able to do that, especially if you also want a lot of inputs, a lot of outputs, and the McIntosh meters. I mean, it's a steal compared to the C70, where it is much more dumbed down. There's not a lot of features other than the basics that you need. So I can see clients preferring one or the other.
One thing I think I forgot to mention is macrodynamics. And when I say macrodynamics, I'm not putting it in linear terms. I'm talking about the studio term, macrodynamics. And that's when you mix and master on certain parts of the song, the engineer would add plus 2 or 3 dB to add excitement when it comes like, you hear the soft voices and then it kicks in and you're like, yes, right? That's when they add 2 or 3 dB. And that's like a point where it gets a little bit louder than other parts of the song. On certain tracks that I listened to, especially E Devo, which she hated, that was very apparent that the C70 had a little bit of a, I wouldn't say a smearing, but a smoothness to it that kind of made it that if it was actually plus 3 dB, and I'm not saying, I know exactly what the measurements were, but if it was, for example, plus 3 dB, it felt like more like plus 1.5, plus 2 dB, whereas the C2700 really kicked in, and I was like, oh, there's the excitement. Would you agree?
There was a difference.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, so I think we agree from a big perspective that the 2700 on paper seems to do more. And if you want to call it the quote-unquote audiophile characteristics, it seems to definitely do more. But I think if you've been in this industry long enough and played with enough equipment, there are things that impress you, and then there are things that somehow just musically just tweak you. And for me, the 70 did it for me. I by no means am I disagreeing with either of them. I think we all heard very similar things.
Yeah.
I just happen to like the sound overall, the perspective overall of the C70. It just drew me into the music in a way where I just kept forgetting to pay attention to making notes. It didn't do quite the same for me with the 2700. But as I say, I think they're both superb, and I don't think you can go wrong with either.
The difference is, again, minute. And I think that the C2700, okay, I shouldn't say that, but I think that the C70, for those of you that really like the McIntosh sound, is more McIntosh. I'll just put it at that.
I think that both are.
Both are.
Yeah, this is where we may have a slight disagreement, not in just more in context. The 2700 certainly represents more of what McIntosh today happens to be. Still very beautiful, still very lovely tone. As Jay mentioned earlier, very rarely will you hear a McIntosh system that will turn you off and sound bright and harsh unless the recording is really that bad. I have a hard time thinking either of them could be a bad choice for anybody unless you're looking for hyper detail, hyper speed, hyper transparency, neither of which is something that McIntosh specifically strives for. I'll just mention very quickly a couple of examples of what I meant and tracks that you can use to compare. Fink, Trouble's What You're In. Right at the very start, he's playing the guitar by himself, live concert, and he smacks on the body of the guitar, and there's this visceral power that both did really, really well with. But for me, the C70 just pulled me in. I was just there listening to what he was singing.
That's also a live recording, correct?
Yeah. I hate this cut because we play it all the time, but I use it as part of the testing protocol. James Blake, Limit to Your Love. As I say, I hate it, but it's really overproduced. But if you ever wanted to test your system to see if it can really plumb the bass depths, this cut can do it. And again, from time to time, I will use it just to see how deep the bass can go and so on. And a cut that I don't think I've ever mentioned to the guys, but maybe I have, Johnny Cash, The Beast in Me. It's recorded very intimately just before he passed away. It's quite poignant that way. He's right there with the microphone and the guitar. He's just singing. And when the system is set up really well, you don't have to close your eyes. He's right there in the room. It sounds like he's just there in the room, just the two of you. He's just singing for you, playing for you. And there have been a few instances where I've been able to get that system working so that it sounds like that. And this morning it sounded like that. For me, when the C70 was on, Johnny Cash was in the room, command performance, just two old buddies, and he's just playing a guitar and almost so emotional that I got teary-eyed. So that's another cut that if you haven't listened to it, check it out. Any final last words, guys? No?
Oh, I think.
Okay. Well, I want to thank Natalya for joining us and for giving us her very valuable input. Thank you very much, Natalya. I hope that you'll join us again in the future. And hopefully, Philip, you'll feel better. So if you like this video, please subscribe, turn on notification. If you have comments, thoughts, questions, and also topics for future videos that you'd like us to see, like us to do, I should say, please either send us an email. Might be better to send us an email so this way I can put it and add it to a list of things that I have on the go. And as always, we appreciate your watching. Thanks very much. This is Adrian, Audio Excellence, and we'll see you again next time. Bye-bye.